wander in, including some that are in the conference room. As you all know, I'm Alicia Fitz, Historic Commission. Dana Giroux, our librarian, is here, and our wonderful friends of the library, Naomi Derryberry's at the back. Keep talking today. We are really excited to have Eric Jacobson here from Villa Franklin Trust, currently managing the Rippa Villa property. I'm going to pass out some brochures. Please go out to Rippa Villa. What the Villa Franklin Trust has managed to do out there in terms of allowing the house and the people of the property to tell that story is really incredible. Sometimes we all do this, even in our own homes. We have so much stuff that you forget the stories of individual pieces, you forget the stories behind pieces. Eric's crew out there has done a tremendous amount of research. Eric has actually been traipsing around one of the oldest cemeteries in the community, which is not a public cemetery, it's on the back of a private property, but he's been, I think, like a kid in a candy store, discovering some of the history of Spring Hill. So we'll get to him in a second. Reminders, please silence your phones. I just had to do the same thing, so those of you who haven't done that. Bathrooms, straight out this hallway, straight to the back. Reminder, you have on your chairs the Founders Day activities that we've been talking about for a couple months now. Basically, on May the 2nd, we have a speaker who is coming to talk about farming and the changes in farming over the last few years, Brooks Lamb. On Saturday, there's going to be continuous speakers, activities in this room, including a tractor show in the parking lot. This is our first time doing it. It's the second time the city's made an attempt. It's our first time doing it. So please register for events. We truly do not know who's going to be here and who's not. But we've got some of the speakers that you've heard before. And since we had Eric coming this time, we thought we would leave Founders Day to some others. Next year, we want to expand it out to Fisher Park and have craftsmen, maybe a pie eating contest, maybe we'll get our hands on the old jail and you can jail the mayor, that kind of thing. So this is the beginning for us. So please take the brochure, pass it out, share it with folks, and again, make sure that you register. So, because of Founders Day, and because the fourth Thursday in May falls on Memorial Day weekend, we are not having a speaker on that Thursday night. We will pick back up on the fourth Thursday in June, topic yet to be discovered, and probably an off-site visit because the library is booked for one of their many activities. So stay tuned to the usual spots, and we'll take care of that. In the meanwhile, Eric, thank you. You're doing the first in what I hope will be sort of a series on the women of Spring Hill versus all the guys that are already well-known and famous. And I think Eric has discovered in a lot of his research that some of the women are actually intriguing figures in and of their own right. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric. I'm going to pass out the brochures, take one and pass it on, and then we'll have some other ones at the brochure table on Saturday the 4th. By the way, since many of you know our faces, we're also going to be wearing these lovely bright yellow shirts. So if there's any confusion, because we're going to have the usual Saturday crowd at the library, if there's any confusion or questions that you need to ask, we've got plenty of volunteers. They'll all be in a yellow shirt. Just find one of those yellow shirts and ask them a question, and then they may call Dana and I and Naomi and ask the question again. But it's meant to be an educational experience. It's also just meant to be a community experience. Some of you are new, some of you have been here a good while, but I love the fact that I can walk into this room early, and some of you are early, and you're having a whole conversation because you've been through the series together. That's a part of what we wanted to do. So thank you for that. Eric, it is all yours.
Thank you, Dana. It was nice to see. I saw Linda come in, and I saw Naomi for the first time in a while. Jack, is that you? I thought I recognized another face in the back of the room. So Alicia mentioned I've been poking around cemeteries. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yeah. You good? All right. So Alicia mentioned I've been poking around cemeteries. Well, I've been doing that for a long time. I don't know how many of you have lived in Spring Hill for more than 25 years. I've been here over 20 years, but I was poking around this area back in the 90s because I was Well, I was trying to learn as much as I could, which later turned into my first book about the military campaign through this area, and I wanted to understand Spring Hill so that I could better understand Franklin. And I know when I first saw Rippa Villa, it was not open to the public, but I traipsed all over Murray County in search of the past. Although I don't believe in ghosts, I have said many times, I chased the ghosts of the past for probably most of my adult life. And then I moved here, and I live in Murray County, although I lived in Spring Hill, just across the Williamson County side for a long time. I'm actually looking for something on my phone while I'm talking to you. I now live in Murray County. So I've worked at Carnton. We started managing Carter House. We've managed Rippa Villa since 2021. And the Battle of Franklin Trust is a nonprofit. So in essence, it's organically or governmentally, it's the same as what the nonprofits that used to run all the historic sites were. We just manage all three, which allows a lot of consistency and actually a lot of cost savings. So we have probably 110,000 visitors a year. We've got 40 employees. We're open 7 days a week, so Alicia's right. You need to come out and see us, and you have no excuse because we're open all the time. If you have never been to Rippa Villa, you won't know what it once looked like, especially on the inside or on the grounds. If you have been and haven't in the last 3 years, it's a lot different. When we took over, the house was empty, which, although somewhat annoying, was a blessing because it allowed us to do a lot of work within the house that was necessary. And also now we've moved furniture back in really throughout the house. And our interpretation is vastly different. And that's not unique to Rippa Villa. Having been in this field a long time, if you had visited Monticello or Mount Vernon in the 1980s, I assure you what you hear today wasn't the same as what you heard then. And the same at a lot of historic sites. You know, there are certain facts that don't change, but there's also bad history. There's sloppy fictional history. And then there are new things that are learned. So history itself may be static, but the evolution of interpretation is not. And it moves on and adjusts. And quite honestly, the world that we live in isn't the same as the world of the 1970s. So it allows us different perspectives. It allows us to understand a lot of the social changes that also are part of history. You know, if one lived through the civil rights era, that was what you were living through. That is now part of history. And if you lived through the Civil War, that wasn't history. That was your life. And a little bit about what I'm going to talk about tonight is about not just Susan Peters McKissack Cheairs, Nat Cheairs' wife, but who she was as her own person. But also a number of, well, at least several other women who are either directly connected to Rippa Villa or through the Cheairs family. So that's a little bit of preface about what we're going to talk about. And I will tell you that if you've ever heard me speak, how long do I have to talk, by the way?
Before we walk out of the room.
30 minutes? Anybody who's ever heard me, I'm pretty transparent and I don't have much of a filter. So I will tell you exactly what's on my mind, but I will also tell you exactly how, at least I and many others, interpret history. And this particular period, the mid-19th century, is not a romantic era. This is an era of violence, of poverty and wealth, of power, expansion, slavery, avarice, greed, and fissure that tore this country apart. We often look back at the American Civil War in this sort of romantic way. That war cost the lives of 750,000 people, which would be almost 7 million today, and we should never forget that. The people who created a romantic aura of the war were almost exclusively people who never fought it or were removed by it by generations. And they experienced the war through reenactments and Moonlight and Magnolia paintings, or maybe in the 1980s they watched North and South. And so the Civil War had become sexy when you could put Patrick Swayze into a Confederate uniform, right? It became palatable. But there were other things going on that have long been forgotten. So who was, to start with, Susan Peters McKissack? Well, Susan Peters McKissack had deep connections through DNA to one of the founders of this area. So when I talk about Spring Hill or Murray County, for the sake of this, they're almost interchangeable, because Spring Hill was really not much of anything for a couple of decades, and in fact it wasn't really even considered a town until almost 25 or 30 years after the first white settlers got here. The legislature, or the General Assembly, allowed its boundaries to be created in the late 1830s, and essentially at that point it was a village and then was a town for many years. But Susan Peters McKissack was connected to James Peters. James Peters was one of the early settlers in this area. Of course, anybody who knows anything about Spring Hill knows Spring Hill's deep ties to Methodism. One of the things that all I ever knew about a Methodist church was I got married in one. But I learned that the Cheairs and the Peters and many members of the McKissacks weren't just Methodists. Who's a Methodist? Anybody Methodist? Not many. You know, the Methodist Church was the biggest church in America in the pre-Civil War era. There wasn't anybody even close to Methodists. The Baptists were second, and they were way behind the Methodists. Weren't many Catholics. Presbyterians were lagging far behind. The Methodist movement was huge. And Peters was one of the early founders of Methodism in this area. The Methodists were really, in its initial phases, a much more liberal wing of the political, or of the religious spectrum. But the church split by the 1840s over the issue of slavery. These were things, as I tell you, that weren't foreign to people like Susan Peters McKissack, or anybody who lived at Rippa Villa, or anybody who lived in Spring Hill or Murray County. These were the realities of life. But we know her, and we know more about her story because of who she married. Okay? And that's just a truth. She married a man named Nat Cheairs, whose father, Nathaniel, was one of the early settlers. So if you looked at people like the Peters and Susan's father, William, the McKissacks, the Russells, the Sanfords, these were the people who founded this area. These were the people who owned hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres. And when you cobbled it all together, it was thousands of acres. Think about what this area was like when these people got here. Now, Susan wasn't born here. Okay? She was actually born in North Carolina, came here when she was young. But think about what this area was like. So Tennessee's created as a state in 1796. Nathaniel Cheairs, who would later be Susan's father-in-law, bought his first tract of land in 1811. This was the West, before there was ever such a thing. This was a wild area. And one of the things that went on for years and years was a massive amount of clearing. You know, we look at these areas where there are tracts of trees, there's open space. There wasn't much open space. So people had to work like the devils themselves just to be able to farm anything. This was the world people like Susan, they knew that in North Carolina where they had come from. And they knew that here. But these are really the mechanics of their lives. She married Nat Cheairs in 1841. And they had, I noticed actually on the website, somebody sent me a link. If you read it, it said she had 5 children. So unless we lost someone somewhere, she only had 4 children. She had 2 boys and 2 girls. How many of you have visited Rippa Villa in the past? Oh, so the whole room has. The children, which we'll talk about in a bit, all survivors. So unlike a lot of people, the Cheairs, they didn't lose any of their children. 2 boys, 2 girls, Jenny, Sally, William, and Thomas. Thomas is a bit of a mystery. We, in our efforts to uncover this, and so I tell you a little bit about Thomas, there's going to be a little bit of a story about Susan. Thomas is a mystery. We don't really know we don't know a lot about Thomas, let's say that. But what we do know is this. Thomas was never married, and other than a very short stint, he never lived anywhere other than Rippa Villa. In fact, after his mother died and his father sold the place, he didn't leave. He stayed with his brother. So initially, it just makes you wonder, what's the story here? We know he could read and write, or at least we have some evidence that he could. We believe the evidence indicates that Thomas could likely have been high-functioning autistic. He fits all of the categories. Family story, and this is a word we don't use today, but was used a lot, is that he was retarded. I don't think that he was, but there was something that didn't categorize him into the, let's say, normal box, right? So why does this matter? This was Susan's son. And as a mother, what are you going to try and do except help this child? Which initially, she may not have known exactly what it was that was causing Thomas to perhaps be slightly different. Because that wasn't diagnosed in those days, right? All sorts of things were kept secret, lied about, covered up. People were shunted aside, sent off to this place or that place where things were done to them. That didn't happen to Thomas. They just sheltered him for years, really almost his entire life. He lived into his 60s. This was one of the things that a woman like Susan had to do, and that would have been almost solely her job, because God knows men, even today, often don't carry the weight with children. They hardly did much of anything prior to the 20th century, unless they absolutely had to, perhaps because of the death of their wife. So this would have fallen exclusively to a woman like Susan. These people, and I'm going to tell you this because this is a key part of understanding the dynamic of men and women, and that in this particular sphere, there ain't a bit of difference. Slavery. Anyone who grew up in this era and was white and had any money was knee-deep in slavery from before they could remember anything. And I tell you that because none of us were. So we have no idea what it was like to be raised in such an environment. But we cannot deny it. And we should never deny it. Because one of the greatest mind games played on people, especially as children, is when they're young, they're not consciously aware of things like color. But eventually you do. You become consciously aware of all sorts of things as you get older. And then white and black would be separated. This happened to Susan. As a child, she was actually willed a slave, a young enslaved girl, by her grandmother. Now, I don't know about you, and I'm not trying to make light of this. None of us will ever get anything like that in a will. That is an introduction into a system and a way of life that you are given as a young person, another human being, by your grandparent. So marrying into the Cheairs clan, who between the 4 brothers, 3 of them who lived here and 1 in Mississippi, their father indeed was somewhat like a Moses. He spawned this immense empire. These 4 brothers owned almost 350 people. Susan's own father owned land all over, owned slaves in multiple counties and multiple states. We all know the McKissack home that's here in Spring Hill, right? Oh, that's just a place for him to stay. His business dealings were all over Giles County. In fact, a good bit of what is downtown Pulaski was built by William McKissack's endeavors and his slaves. All the way up and down the Middle Tennessee corridor, this was the way of life. So marrying into the Cheairs family was like breathing. It was another step in the process as the McKissacks and the Cheairs sort of melded together. And then what had happened to Susan and what had happened to Nat begins to happen to their children. Thomas aside, Will, Jenny, Sally are all born into this environment. I'm only giving you the preface. The American Civil War changed everything. And it changed it almost in the blink of an eye. What began in the summer of 1860 was aware to everyone, male or female, north or south, what was brewing, because it had been brewing for a decade. And what's interesting about the women's perspective, as I stand up here as a man telling you about it, I'm married and have 2 daughters, so I'm quite familiar with the female experience. And any guy in this room knows that women are incredibly in tune, and often quieter than we are. Don't think that people like Susan didn't know what was going on, because they sat at the dinner table. They heard the conversations. They knew who was running for office and who wasn't. They knew the great gulf and divide. And frankly, they knew the difference between Tennessee and Mississippi. But they also knew the difference between Tennessee and Ohio. And they knew that slavery wasn't just about owning someone. Because what is the bifurcation between white and black? It's not about free and slave. It's about the color of one's skin. Because slavery is as much about ownership as it is about a social construct. As someone who loves baseball and thinks it's the only sport that God ever invented, that's why there's no clock. I'm serious. Only man could make up hockey and football. God. I won't comment on other sports. Why couldn't Jackie Robinson play baseball until 1947? Not because he couldn't play the game. Slavery was the racial, social, and political issue that ripped this country apart. And people like Susan McKissack Cheairs and her husband, their friends, their contemporaries, their family members, all knew it. The Republican Party was an anti-slavery party, and the Democrats were not. One was anti-slavery, one was not. 7 states seceded and dragged Virginia, Tennessee, and Arkansas, and North Carolina into a war. And it was the women, north and south, but we're going to focus on a handful of them in the south, who paid an ungodly price. So what happens at Rippa Villa? Well, early in the war, Nat Cheairs, of course, like many others, joins the Confederate Army, and off he goes to war. Remember, it was all going to be an adventure, right? A couple of battles, a few weeks, a few months, and everyone would come home. What naivety. And it's not like everybody was, because there were many people warning against taking this step. There were people warning in the South. Here's a fun story about the Cheairs, which again, this is all about Susan, but it's all bound together. Do you know that they were supporters of John Bell? Anybody know who John Bell was? Didn't think we'd talk politics. We can talk politics, right? It's a presidential election year. It was then too. John Bell was the candidate who wasn't a Democrat and wasn't a Republican. The Cheairs were old Whigs. They didn't trust Democrats. They supported John Bell. John Bell carried this state. He won it in the 1860 election. Of course, Lincoln didn't have a chance. He wasn't even on the ballot. And the Democrats were too busy ripping each other apart. The Cheairs chose the third party. They didn't want this war. They weren't looking for a war. But as Nat Cheairs said, when Murray County voted to secede, Williamson County did not. So you can see the divides right here, right across the county line. It wasn't just East Tennessee and West Tennessee. It's divisions right here in Middle Tennessee. All you have to do is go to Shelbyville, most pro-union city in Middle Tennessee, some people said. But Nat went off to fight, leaving Susan at home. You've been inside Rippa Villa. Imagine being in that place, all by yourself. Your oldest daughter is grown. You have a son who needs care. And then you have the 2 younger ones. And your house sits right on the edge of the interstate that ran through Middle Tennessee. And the troop movements through this area were tremendous. Long before there was a Battle of Spring Hill and the Battle of Franklin. In fact, in early 1862, Don Carlos Buell's army is pouring south out of Nashville through Franklin on its way to the Battle of Shiloh. They were caught up north of Rutherford Creek. Couldn't get across the bridge right there. You know Rutherford Creek, right where Carter's Creek Pike comes into 31. They got stuck there. And so General William Nelson took Rippa Villa as his headquarters and threw Susan outside. Kicked her out of the house. Hard war. No rules. That was probably the first introduction. This wasn't about good or bad manners, folks. This is about all of a sudden this thing that some people all over this area had been pushing for. We're going to secede. We're going to be independent. We're going to form our own nation. Well, all of a sudden when the invasion started and you got thrown outside, things got real very quickly. And you have children. And what happens the minute that soldiers begin to arrive? This is before the Emancipation Proclamation. What's happening? What's happening in Tennessee and Virginia? Because they're the front lines. What's happening? Slaves are escaping everywhere. There was no Emancipation Proclamation. In fact, what was happening in Tennessee and Virginia was that enslaved people were deciding they were just going to take matters into their own hands. They didn't have to wait for somebody to tell them, by the way, you're free, you can go now. They just said, well, those guys in the blue uniforms, we know what they're standing for. We know what the guys in the other uniforms want to do, so we're going to go to that side. It forced the Lincoln administration, by January 1st, 1863, to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Susan Cheairs saw that firsthand. She was watching the decay, the corruption, fall to pieces in front of her. There's a great book written years ago, The Fall of the House of Dixie. To see a system that existed for about 250 years collapse in about 18 months was almost like a supernova that went off. And it didn't go off in the north, it went off in the south. And when I said about the social order of things, do you know how many enslaved people there were at Rippa Villa in 1860? 75. Susan was there with her 4 children. There were 5 white people. How are you going to control 75 people? They didn't need guns. They didn't need weapons. They just needed to walk away because you couldn't stop them. Because the whole system of control had collapsed when the U.S. Army arrived. And what happens is they start arming black men. Worst fear, particularly for rich white people, was a black person with a gun. It was a horrifying notion to them. And the U.S. Army was handing out rifles by the thousands and giving them uniforms. Sometimes I learned that history has often these blank spots, these empty pages, where people don't tell you what was happening. I'm just old enough that my grandparents lived through the Great Depression, and I was raised and grew up around many people who'd fought in the Second World War. And I couldn't count on one hand the dozens and dozens and dozens of people that I was related to or knew who ever wrote about it or ever hardly ever talked about it, because it was so awful. The Depression was so awful, and the war was so terrible, and the cost was so great that they barely talked about it. Many of us in this room, you're old enough to know exactly what I'm talking about, don't you? It's the same thing with the people who lived through some of these horrors of the Civil War. What could you say? Every one of your neighbors knew it to be true. So sometimes you talked about it with yourselves, but you didn't say a whole lot because you'd all been through it. You'd watched the collapse occur, and you were helpless, utterly helpless to stop it. And you'd lived your entire life. Susan was born 40 years before the American Civil War. She had lived a good long life. And all of a sudden, like that, the control is disintegrating. Your husband is gone, and you do not know what to do because you can't stop the avalanche that's coming downhill at you. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. What we have learned in recent months about the extended members of the Cheairs family, I'm going to share with some of you for the first time ever tonight. Because this isn't just about Susan Cheairs. And it isn't just about Rippa Villa. And it isn't just about this little spot on the globe. This ripple effect was cascading all over the Old South. one of Nat Cheairs' brothers, Susan's brother-in-law, was named Thomas. Thomas Cheairs lived in Marshall County, Mississippi, just south of Fayette County, if you know where that's at. And Fayette County butts right up to Shelby, so right there on the northern border of Mississippi, southern border of Tennessee. Thomas Cheairs died in 1860. So when the war began, his wife was already a widow, and she watched two of her sons go off to war, one of whom was in his junior year at the University of Mississippi when it all started. Their names were William and James. James enlisted in the 30th Mississippi Infantry. He fought at the Battle of Murfreesboro, heavily engaged on December 31st, 1862, the day before the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. James Cheairs' unit smashed into the left flank of the U.S. Army in an area known today as the Round Forest, crashing into federal troops, mostly from what we know today as the Midwest. He survived that battle, only to become very ill and have to resign his commission. And he died in Carrollton, Mississippi, at some point in 1863. The other son, and she had more than these two children. She'd already lost babies and her husband. And now one son was dead, and soon was the other. The other son, William, is quite an interesting story. William served in a Mississippi unit and was heavily engaged on the first day of the Battle of Shiloh. I don't know how William and some of his compatriots ever got out of the fix they were in. Their commanding officer was killed. Their company commander was killed, and about a third of the company lay dead or wounded. Cheairs ended up in Tullahoma months later, very ill. Tuberculosis and diarrhea. Chronic. His aunt, Nancy, one of Nat's other sisters, Susan's sister-in-law, lived in Columbia. We now believe that Will, who got a furlough, went from Tullahoma to Columbia to stay with them. He died on February 7th, 1863, and is buried with Nancy Cheairs Perkins and her husband Constantine. And although I'm not going to talk a lot about Nancy, her husband died 6 days before the Battle of Franklin. So Nancy had to bury her nephew, and then she lost her husband. Meanwhile, in Mississippi, Mrs. Cheairs had now lost a husband and two sons. But that was not all. This is how impacted the Cheairs family was. One of Nat's other sisters, one of Susan's other sister-in-laws, Louisa, had married a man named John Campbell. They had moved to Springfield, Missouri. She had two sons who went off to war. They both died. And for sake of time, I'm going to skip over one of them and finish with the youngest one, Thomas. Thomas was in Missouri in 1860, but for some reason enlisted in a Tennessee outfit, maybe because his kin was all from Tennessee. He was captured at the Battle of Chickamauga on September 19, 1863. An editorial comment. Some of the commanders involved in that nighttime fighting were named John Bell Hood, Patrick Claiborne, and Frank Cheatham. And one of the reasons that the Spring Hill debacle unfolded the way that it did was because Frank Cheatham and Patrick Claiborne were both concerned about stumbling around in the dark on November 29, 1864, because they'd done it on September 19, 1863, and gotten a whole bunch of their men killed. Because as one brigade moved into the fray, another crossed paths with it and ran right into federal troops they weren't expecting. Preston Smith, the brigade commander, was killed, and Louisa Campbell's boy, Thomas, was captured. He was 21. They took him off to Camp Douglas in Chicago. Ever been to Chicago? I don't think the wind ever stops blowing, and it's cold in the wintertime. And I was raised in Minnesota, and I never liked going to Chicago in the winter. And there they sat down on Lake Avenue in October and November as the winter started to set in, down on the lakefront. He was dead within 2 months. They buried him in the city cemetery. After the war, they were exhumed and moved to Oak Grove Cemetery, which is today where the Confederate, what they call the Confederate Mound, is located. All of the bodies were buried together. His name is one of those on these massive bronze plaques that have, the patina has become this sort of ocean blue color today. There he is, 23rd Tennessee. These women never got to say goodbye. There were no Facebook posts, there were no letters, there were no phone calls, there were no telegrams, there was nothing. They were just gone and they were dead. The other one, I thought for the sake of time, but it seems, why skip him? He joined cavalry unit. Do you know the commander of the cavalry unit that Louisa Campbell's son served in? Guess who commanded the cavalry regiment? And it's not Nathan Bedford Forrest. He's not the answer for everything. Guess who commanded the cavalry? You never guess. If you do, I'll give you $50. His name was Alexander McKissack. He was Susan's brother. He had graduated from Yale. And he lived in Mississippi when the war broke out. And on May 13th, 1864, his cavalry unit was sent out to try and block an infantry force that was moving across near Benton, Mississippi to rip up a railroad track. McKissack's cavalry was just pushed aside by the infantry, but before they shoved them aside, they unlimbered a couple of pieces of artillery, shelled a belt of timber. Louisa's son was killed. Meanwhile, back here, the war went on. Emancipation was in full effect. We now know of at least a dozen Cheairs slaves who escaped and joined the U.S. Army. Susan Cheairs knew those people. She knew every single one of them. She knew their names. One of those, you might want to strap yourselves in for this one. One of those former Cheairs slaves who didn't escape from Rippa Villa also joined the U.S. Army. But he joined the U.S. Army in Arkansas. His name was Gilbert Cheairs. Gilbert Cheairs was born not long before Nat and Susan were married. Like I said, strap yourself in. Gilbert, later in life, believed that his father was his owner. His father wasn't the man who owned him. His father was his owner's son. We now are certain that Nat Cheairs fathered Gilbert with an enslaved woman named Mary Ann. This was not a secret. Almost everybody, including Susan, knew. When Nat's father died, he had a will. And then when Nathaniel Cheairs' wife, Sarah, died, she had a will. And Mary Ann and Gilbert were sent to two different places. And the mother and the son and Sarah's own son were split up three different ways. Now, I can't tell you how that played out the day that it happened. But it happened right there at Rippa Villa. because that is an intentional act by someone knowing full well who Mary Ann was and who Gilbert was and who the father was, because it was her son. And Nat certainly knew. Gilbert Cheairs and Nat later met each other. Nat acknowledged him. Nat knew who he was. Gilbert knew who he was. In fact, when he was sent away, he changed his name. And he became known as, are you ready for what his sister called him? Changed his name from Gilbert to Nathan, short for Nathan. And changed his last name to Perkins, which was their name. So he was Nathan Perkins. But he was really Gilbert Cheairs. Today he is buried at the Memphis National Cemetery. We have started the paperwork necessary with the Veterans Administration to change his headstone to Gilbert Cheairs, because he was never Nathan Perkins. And he lived until 1912, when he passed away. Susan was quite aware of this. And then the war came calling. In the summer of 1864, as the war was spinning towards its end, but no one knew exactly how it would play out, the war came full circle. John Bell Hood's army and John Schofield's army, moving up through Middle Tennessee from Pulaski through Linville to Columbia, put Spring Hill right in the center of the action. Now, I must say on a personal note, I remember being here back in the 90s, and I couldn't find anybody who ever even knew there was a Battle of Spring Hill, but that's a different story altogether. Because literally, I met people who said nothing happened. And I always thought, well, that's odd. There were about 750 casualties, so I don't know, that's something. But see, like other things, it was forgotten. Franklin overshadowed it. Time went on. But the Cheairs and everybody who was here certainly never forgot what happened. That night must have been a night that they had probably been dreading now for the better part of 2.5 years. And it had already been a rough year. Earlier that summer, there was a murder in Spring Hill. A well-known Murray County fellow who had done a good job infiltrating Confederate units and getting intel was actually shot in broad daylight by someone else in Murray County. This led federal authorities trying to figure out answers. Now, I know sometimes we look at this and say, how could they do this? Well, we did the same thing in Fallujah. We did it in Berlin. We've done it in all sorts of wars. Wherever you need to try and find intel, sometimes you go talk to civilians. You find out what they know. You start shaking them down for information. You have to, because what they'll end up doing often is harboring the people you're looking for. The sad part is it was happening right here. So federal authorities started looking at the Cheairs. They arrested John Cheairs. They arrested Martin Cheairs, Nat's brothers. And then they went to Rippa Villa, and guess who they arrested? Thomas. Because a 19-year-old kid at home without a uniform on seemed totally out of place. They arrested all three of them, detained them for almost a month. None of them had anything to do with it. They were eventually released. That went on as well. You can see the wear and tear on people. There's no romance. The Battle of Spring Hill unfolded, about a mile or so northeast of Rippa Villa. The fighting, right on the north side of the parkway. Confederate troops came very close to cutting Columbia Pike just north of the house. William Bates' division was probably within 100 to 150 yards of the road right there. They were encamped on that ground across the parkway, all the way up to the east side of Spring Hill. There were 20,000 Confederates stretched across the southeast and east side of Spring Hill that night as the U.S. Army slipped away. Moved north, all the way to Franklin. And then the war ended. I'll finish with a couple of things and then I can take some questions. Just today I spent some time looking at one of the oddest documents and also one of the most personal documents I think I've ever read. In 1876, Susan Cheairs sued her husband in Murray County, Chancery Court. And it's a doozy. It is a doozy. I could give you lots of details, but here's the primary one. She claimed in 1876 that he owed her $65,000. That's a good bit of money today. She claimed that when her father died, he had died intestate, so no will. So Nat became the executor. And she claimed, because all of Susan and her siblings got these blocks of slaves, so each one got like about 20. And there was land that had to be sold, and then that money got dispersed. So she claimed that Nat had, as the executor, had basically done what he was supposed to do, but he kept all the money. Didn't give it to her. Now, I can't tell you where she came up with $65,000. It seems a little capricious to me, but that's the number she came up with. But what's interesting is this. When Nat Cheairs, who had to go through a deposition and answer the questions, think about being in going through this process, right? Your wife's suing you, and then you have to answer her allegations. And you know what he does? He confirmed every one of them. He said, yep, I did that, yep, I did that, yep, I did that. He answered almost in the affirmative on every single one. But he did add one caveat. He basically said, we had a joint account. The money flowed in one place and it came out the other. They were married. They both had to testify they were married. So I think Nat was establishing the case as, there's no separate money. We were married. She was certainly using my money. I was using hers. In essence, right? There was no resolution to the case. At least none that we have found. And I don't really think there was, because court cases now, especially with online tools, you can find out whether they went to the Supreme Court or what the conclusion. This one just seems to sort of die, like a slow death. I was like, what is going on? So I spent a little time looking at it again. And Susan was not only bent out of shape about slaves that her father had given to her and she didn't get the money, she was also complaining about these various land transactions that Nat had gone through in the 1850s, just before the war. She was claiming that he used her money to buy those tracts, and he didn't put her name on the deeds. So now we're getting somewhere, right? Because he's using her money, buying land, and then he could sell it, and she'd have no recourse. So now we're on to something. But again, they weren't divorced. He wasn't selling it. I mean, they were farming it. So there's something to it. There's got to be something else. And months ago, we found this document. Nat had borrowed several $1,000s from his sister, Nancy, in Colombia. He borrowed cash. And he had to pay it back within 12 months. At 10% interest, I think. So we think interest rates are bad. They've always been bad. They've just been cheap the last 20 years, and now we're getting back to reality. So he had to pay back the money. And I remember thinking, wait a second. That happened in the spring of 1876. Isn't it coincidental Susan sued him in December? And I remember on that original document where it's a mortgage that he had with his sister. Because you know what he put up for collateral? Rippa Villa. Not just the house. The 401-acre tract that he built the house on. And I remember, oh, that's why she's all upset about that tract of land. As well as the others that he'd used the money, she was doubly upset about the home place because he was using that as collateral and he hadn't told her. And she found out. I think I said earlier she was hot Cheetos mad. And she sued him. I think what happened in the end, well, I know this, to satisfy that debt, Nat had to get his son-in-law involved. So now he's dragging another woman into the fray, his daughter, who'd married J.M. Moore. So he got J.M. Moore to pay his sister $8,000, not J.M. Moore's sister, he got Moore to pay his sister Nancy to $8,000, but you know what Nat had to give up? 235 acres of Rippa Villa. You know where the tree line is just south of Rippa Villa? All the way to Denning Lane, all that property, he had to carve it off and he gave it away. He literally transferred ownership in exchange for him paying the bill. That's why that land, if you ever want to know why the county owns it today and how GM got it years ago, and why it was always separate from Rippa Villa in our time, is because of Nat Cheairs. And when he transferred the land to the Moors, guess whose name was on the transfer deed this time? Susan Cheairs. This time she got in and made sure her name was on that document because that land now involved her daughter and son-in-law. And I think, after reading it again, that the case never came to a completion because somewhere between husband and wife, I think that resolved the issue. I think she knew all along what Nat had been doing, but there was something about putting the whole home place up on a small amount of money just flipped her switch. And she said, enough of this. And one of the conditions that was discussed, because he had an injunction placed against him. And the injunction said that he could not transact real estate in Tennessee. And from that point forward, although the injunction was never codified, I think it was codified within the walls of Rippa Villa. She told him, here's the deal, bub. You're not buying any more land in Tennessee. We know he bought land in Arkansas several years later that involved his other daughter, Jenny, and her husband. But we have never found another deed. And he was buying and dealing all over the place. He stopped. Here's the end. Nat also started to go to Florida a lot. Nat Cheairs spent probably somewhere between 30 and 40% of his life in Florida. I think that their marriage was irreparably damaged by this. And they came to an agreement, as sometimes the older folks did, and they just didn't get divorced. But I don't know that they were sleeping in the same bed. Because when she died in 1893, he sold that place so fast. He sold Rippa Villa. And when I say Rippa Villa, the name, by the way, just like Carnton, is not just the house. Rippa Villa is the place. It's the property. All of us are old enough to remember the old show, Dallas, South Fork Ranch. They didn't call South Fork the house. It was the whole place. Same thing applies here. Susan died, Nat sold that place within 3 months. And he sold it at a bargain price to his son, Will. And he got out of there. Now, he lived out in western Murray County in Cross Bridges for a while, kept traveling. He spent most of his winters either in Florida or Texas. Later on, his daughter Jenny lived out in Texas, and he spent a lot of time with her there in the later years. But these stories, I think, are not only crucial to understanding the place, they help give everyone a better understanding about a person like Nat Cheairs. But I know from all of the years that I've studied the war, there's been a lot of talk about, the home front. And the home front has a whole myriad of subject matter. It could be deserters, it could be conscript guards, it could be, just how the day-to-day life, farming, how the postal service worked behind the lines during the war. There's a lot of home front issues. I think perhaps the greatest home front issue, other than emancipation, but equal to that, because that certainly is a huge impact on the home front. Let's be honest. There were 1 million escaped slaves by the end of the war. But the biggest impact on the home front was on women. There were so many women who were left behind to fend for themselves. And there were so many women, like Louisa Cheairs Campbell, who lost not only a husband, but lost sons. And there are these empty chairs and these empty spaces, and there's just, nothing. There's no good death. There's no funeral. There's no goodbye. There's just absence. And I think women disproportionately in the South certainly felt that. So I'll end with something about statistics because I've been looking at Mississippi. That in 1860, there were about 380,000 white people who lived in Mississippi. Half of them were women. So you got to carve that number now down to about 190,000, right? a good number of those are too old or too young to ever serve. So maybe you get down to 120,000 or so, maybe, white men of age. And Mississippi's not a big state. So the percentages aren't materially different than other southern states. Mississippi had at least 75 infantry and cavalry regiments. Regiments, 1,000 men. That's 75,000 out of, let's say, 120. That means about 2/3 of the white male population of age was mobilized for the war effort. Just think about living in a world where 2/3 of the people between, roughly 18 and 40 are either gone, have served, many died, some missing limbs. Think about that residual effect on society. And that's the last thing I think to think about when you come back and visit Rippa Villa, and we focus on this a lot. The war ended in 1865, but nothing else did. Life went on. The memories lingered. The old racial issues didn't just disappear overnight. We all know that, if we're honest with ourselves. It didn't stop. And after about 10 years of Reconstruction, quite frankly, many Northerners in Washington, D.C. just gave up on the South. And we abandoned it like we've abandoned other places, in other countries, because we just didn't have the stomach to see it all the way through. And I think 160 years later, we're finally in a much better place. We're reckoning with the past, and I don't think there's a better place to learn it than places like Rippa Villa. It's a big old beautiful house, it is that. But there is a history there that is rich and deep and very real. And the last thing I guess I would remind everyone is they were real people. They were like us. They just lived in different times. They were happy, they were sad, they were frightened, they were alone, they got angry, they lived long lives, they watched people die. They were a lot like us. But they did live in a materially different era. And it's okay to analyze that. It helps us better understand who we are today. Because a lot of people will make excuses for the past, and they'll say, well, you can't change history. And I'm like, you're right about that. But that doesn't mean we can't talk about it. We don't have to sugarcoat it. And a place like Rippa Villa, I think, is a great place to come and see a little bit of our past and understand a little bit more about our present. Thank you very much. Questions? Oh, come on. Somebody else.
There you go. So where did Susan go when she got kicked out of the house?
According to the one account that I've seen, she was in the slave quarters. There wasn't any other place to go. But slave quarters could have been the kitchen wing too. But regardless, just getting kicked out of your own place was a humiliating experience. Yes, sir.
Before the war, she probably lived a life of pleasure and ease. And 4 years later, she sort of, might say, out in the street. Did she ever write about her feelings about that?
No. That's why I mentioned earlier, so many people don't. She is very much the norm. When Nat got home, I will tell you this, because he got home in early June of '65, he said that his wife and children were living on government rations. Because, the slaves were gone, and they couldn't farm. Not anything significant. And honestly, I'll tell you, they didn't know how. One of the most, and anybody who knows me, I'm from the North, but I left there a long time ago, and I love the South. But I will tell you, so many Northern soldiers out of the Midwest who had Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, who'd worked their whole lives as farmers, especially, they're out in the rural, they wrote over and over again how utterly worthless much of the rich white population of the South was. They couldn't believe that there were white people who didn't know how to put a saddle on a horse. They didn't know how to run a plow. They literally had no idea how to do any work. Now, poor whites were totally different because they had been doing that. But you saw these Northern soldiers literally dumbfounded that there were white people who were just helpless. They couldn't draw water out of a well. They didn't know how. Didn't know how to cook. And it's pretty stunning. So, yeah, it's a life of luxury, but it's also, you live such a detached existence that you are. They're on government rations. They didn't know what to do. Yes, ma'am.
What did the family at Rippa Villa do before the war? Did they farm? I mean, how did they make their money?
Land and lots of it, but corn, grain, livestock, and some cotton.
Oh, okay.
It's a very, like a lot of farms in this area, I mean, people grew cotton, but Tennessee, if you looked at it, just Randy is there, we've talked about like the commodity aspect of Tennessee. If you looked at commodity production here and compared it to Illinois, you'd hardly know which state was which. The massive amounts of corn and grain grown here just dwarf cotton or anything else. And of course, they're not growing rice or sugar cane here.
All right.
And listen, it's a beautiful, the climate's perfect for it. It's just an agriculturally rich state. So that's just like at Carnton. John McGavick never grew cotton. It's corn and grain.
And then part of the reason that this area has been such fertile farmland, we wound up mining later on in history. We wound up mining phosphate in Spring Hill and in Mount Pleasant, especially in Mount Pleasant. Phosphate's a key ingredient in fertilizer, and it was in the soil. So this was very, very rich, not monetarily, but rich in terms of what could be grown here. Cotton's probably one of the few crops that really wasn't grown here a whole lot, in spite of interpretations of us being in the South.
Cotton was much more popular in this area early. But once it got ramped up in the Deep South, Tennessee kind of weaned itself of it. Nathaniel Cheairs, the father, grew far more, I think, in the early years than we'll probably ever really realize. There was a cotton factory on the Duck River in the 1820s, but eventually corn and grain. And when I say the climate's right, like growing up where I did, the thing about corn and crops like wheat and oats, it loves the sun. Corn loves heat. That's what it is. You can grow it in a can on your deck if you want to. I mean, it just loves the heat. And this is a perfect climate. It's not too hot. It's not like Mississippi, and it's a longer growing season than up north, so man, you can grow it like crazy.
And you could grow multiple crops.
Yep.
People still do. Right?
Yes, sir.
Did you find, or have you yet found any connection between the McKissack family here and the McKissack family that was so prominent in central South Carolina, that supposedly also came from North Carolina?
I don't think so. I haven't found any South Carolina connections. Yeah, no, doesn't mean there isn't one. We have found things that it does remind me of when I was working on my first book. It's not like we're the smartest people in the world. We're just crazy enough to dig, and it's always been. Some of you remember Bob Duncan. I mean, I would sit in his office just visit after visit after visit. And old Bob, his best advice to me was just keep digging. It's there. You just got to keep looking for it. And that's what we've been doing. I mean, we've learned things that sometimes I have to ask myself, how did nobody never know this? But I do think you have to have a little bit of insanity to keep it.
Where did you find the document on the lawsuit?
On the what?
On the lawsuit?
Just Chancery Court records. It just great thing about a lot of the internet has revolutionized research in this aspect. It'll tell you where to look for things. Sometimes you can't find the digitized document, but at least you can know where to look. And so Ancestry is just a wonderful collection, and often very much uncategorized kind of documents, which is a click, 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 click. You just have to go and go and go to eyes. It's like looking at microfilm. That's an up and down thing, so now your eyes are going sideways. So it's just a different way of doing the same thing, and you just have to, you have to be, I do think there's two things. You have to be dedicated, and you have to actually be able to analyze data. And that is, I'll be honest, that's a skill. Some people can hit a baseball and some people can't. And I've seen a lot of people that collect a lot of data and they're just not really good at interpreting it. And I'm being quite plain. I've seen bad interpretation. There's another thing I talked to Bob Duncan about. Guys like Bob Duncan or Rick Warwick are some of the greatest historians I ever met, and they're not academics. You know, they were just dedicated guys looking for the truth. But it's fun. You know, it's fun being able to find things that are able to tell you the complexities of people's lives. And if they fight and argue with each other, just like we do. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that Reconstruction kind of faded away after about 10 years or so.
Yeah.
Hasn't there been a lot of speculation by historians that if Lincoln had lived, that had been a whole different story?
I'm going to couch my response carefully. I think that any historian of merit who has said that is not a good historian. Eric Foner, who is probably America's greatest historian when it comes to Reconstruction, has been very unequivocal for the better part of 30 years that Lincoln's benevolence had an endpoint. And as the war showed, Lincoln was willing to do what was necessary to get to the finish line. And I think that what happened is Lincoln's death terminates his reaction to the resistance. Because what happens throughout 1865 and into 1866 is an unbelievable amount of just pure violence and resistance to the outcome of the war. I mean, to the point by the end of 1865, Southern states had voted in former Confederates to the U.S. Congress, and it just turned into an explosion of controversy. You know, Mississippi's already passed black codes by that fall. I think Foner has effectively said there's no way Lincoln would have let that stuff go on. And he would have probably done what Grant ended up doing, which was sent federal troops back into the South. But it got delayed for 3 more years because Johnson was president. And Johnson was actually more interested in fighting with Republicans than actually trying to solve problems in the South. And so Grant comes in, and for 8 years, Grant really works hard. You know, that's where you get the 14th Amendment, you get the 15th Amendment, you get the first real Civil Rights Act. One of the saddest letters that I think I've ever read from a president is a letter that Grant wrote to the governor of South Carolina just months before he left office. And he talked about the assassination in broad daylight of a South Carolina state legislator named Simon Coker, who was literally taken out in broad daylight. You didn't need to be Ku Klux Klan members. They had the masks off by this time. They took him out in the middle of town, put him on his knees, and shot him in the head. And they got away with it. They weren't arrested. Nobody was charged. Everybody knew what had happened. And Coker was black. And Grant said, this has been the policy of a number of southern states. He did not include Mississippi, by the way, because Mississippi was its own hotbed of Klan activity. But Mississippi and South Carolina were terrible by that time. And he said it is the policy of these states to murder Republicans and Negroes at will. And he said there is a race problem in this country, and I do not know what the solution is. And then he was out of office. And when Hayes and Tilden had the upcoming election, you know, Tilden was the Democrat, and Tilden it was contested, and Tilden conceded it if Hayes would end Reconstruction. And from that moment on, within 10 years, there were Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow became so pervasive, it just leaked into the North. We found a letter written by Nat Cheairs, who was in Arkansas in 1872. And there was a gaggle, a crowd of black men who were not working because they were advocating for higher wages. And Nat wrote to his sister, I believe, and said, it's really too bad that we can't turn their shirt tails on them or a leather strap. And you know, the reaction initially is like, oh, why? But you know, that was his world. That was the form of control, and that didn't end. And, you know, that period from the end of Reconstruction until the early 20th century, you know, that's why civil rights didn't happen until the 50s and the 60s. And it became, I could tell you, growing up in the North, the segregation, the open segregation of the South, became pocketed segregation in the North. Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, Boston, Philadelphia, every city had an enclave of people who weren't white. And it was, you know, that's finally broken down. If we took the last 50 years and put that at the end of the Civil War, we wouldn't have had the racial problems we had in the 20th century. They could have really been solved. But we can't turn back the clock, right? We can only just, I think, honestly say that's what happened, so let's not deny it anymore. And that doesn't mean that people like the Cheairs were bad people, because they weren't. But they were people of their time. And not everybody thought like them. Anything else? Yes, sir. Or yes, ma'am. Sorry.
Where did he, in Florida, did he go?
He loved St. Petersburg.
Oh, okay.
He loved to go fishing in the Gulf of Mexico. He'd go fishing for mackerel. We found he stayed in a place called the Paxton Hotel. From postcard. It's a beautiful place. Photograph of it. With him sitting on the porch, the whole crew of other guys. But yeah, he loved to go fishing. And then what a great place. I mean, tourism had started down there. Nice place to go in the winter.
I have no doubt that there are going to be more questions that you think of in the car or on the way home.
There's
One
one
of
more.
them-
One more.
I'm sorry.
One more.
Back road.
Did he have a mistress there in Florida?
No, I don't think so. I think he traveled there because I think their relationship was rocky for years. But after Susan died, then he really spent a lot of time there. And I think Matt lived to be a very old man. And he got around pretty well until those later years when he started to have some real vision problems and hearing problems. But I think he just enjoyed it. And I think he enjoyed the warmer weather. And I think he was kind of done with Tennessee. I think he was done with what the past had been. I get a sense that Nat Cheairs was really done with the old ways. And had there, I think, maybe been a few more people like him, we might have been better off too. I mean, he certainly had his racial tendencies, but I think he wasn't interested in, at some point, reliving that. He liked Florida. He liked fishing.
There's a couple of other tangents. Eric and I have had recent conversations about the role of the church. He mentioned the Methodist Church. He mentioned the Cheairs' role. Those are things that we talk about today in our political system. It's not that we're repeating things necessarily, but there are some of the same influences that come into play. And so we may try and come up with a session on the role of the church and the Cheairs family and other families, the Thompson family in this town. You think about women, and I've been trying to stretch my brain, Eric, and you, Chrissy, you may know this as well. There's a book that someone had written about how the Civil War changed the role of women. Because women, while they couldn't do the plowing and get into the fields or do that stuff, they were left at home in charge by default, right? And so there's a whole, I can think of the book, I'll get Dana to post it, but think about that. The two things, the Civil War clearly is significant. There are two things that I've read on that I would have never connected. One is how it shifted the role of women. The other is how we treated death after the Civil War. You know, because bodies weren't coming back. You couldn't do wakes in your living room. Embalming, I think, began to become a thing then. So the Civil War was about a whole lot of issues and continues to influence us. And we'll try to dig a little deeper into that. But also think about how that period of time changed our societal structure, not just in terms of race. Okay? I wonder if Susan Cheairs would have sued Nat before the Civil War, or if she felt like there was some impending rage or power that allowed her to stand up and say, I'm not going to do this anymore. I don't know. It's all fodder for thought. Also want to remind you that Rippa Villa, the team at Rippa Villa, Eric and his team have agreed to provide an abbreviated tour on Saturday, May 4th as a part of Founders Day. Many of you have been out there. I have been out there multiple times, and I can promise you that every time I go, after having listened to someone like Eric or even one of our sessions, I see things out there differently. So I would encourage you to go back and do the tour. I'm grateful that the Rippa Villa team, the Ella Franklin Trust team are participating in Founders Day.
No more boxwoods. Doesn't it look great?
Yes, it does. It looks fabulous.
Look, applause for no more boxes.
They were dying.
Oh.
Now there's an opportunity to do something else with the front. So, any other last minute questions before we wrap? Yes, ma'am.
So did Susan have, how did she interact with Spring Hill? So it was a village, very small. She just kind of like hanging out in her house alone, or did she have friends? Or?
You know, one of the things that's really glaringly absent from 19th century newspapers are often the experiences of women, what they were doing.
Absent?
Yeah, they just didn't report unless they were visiting.
They just
somewhere.
say, my cousin came, she stayed a month.
They did a lot of that, but I've not found a lot that she was doing.
I haven't found anything.
Oh,
Yeah.
You can read stuff where, you know, Captain Pointer and Nat Cheairs went to Columbia
Yeah,
and fishing.
there's a lot more of the male visitation doing this and that,
Oh, interesting.
but I don't know. We know she liked to garden. We found some reference that she was a horticulturalist.
I didn't know that was in the newspaper. Did other women?
Also recognize Rippa Villa was 2 miles south of the village.
There's a generational thing. The children of that generation, like her daughters, I think women, I know this, a lot of women her age didn't leave the house a whole lot.
Right.
And it's their daughters and granddaughters who begin to go to school. Some of them are pushing for the right to vote. You know, they're a little more vocal, and you do see some of that early feminist movement. So I think she often stayed at home. She was very sick, I think, in the last couple of years of her life too. When Christy found letters, Nat went to Cuba and was writing her, and she didn't make the trip. And I suspect based on what it was because she couldn't travel. I think she was pretty ill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.